All right. Well, hello and welcome everyone to the fourth episode of A Thousand Paths to a Career in Arbitration. For those who don't know me, I'm Mandy Lee, the founder of Careers in Arbitration. Thank you very much for joining us on this sometimes sunny, depends where you are, I suppose, in the world, Friday afternoon, Friday morning, Friday evening, whatever and wherever you happen to be. So before I turn the floor over to our host with the most, a quick housekeeping point as usual. We are recording this webinar. And so we ask that all participants kindly make sure that they keep their microphones and their videos switched off during the webinar. The networking sessions that will follow this webinar will not be recorded. And so you have the opportunity to turn your speakers on, turn your cameras on, wave at our speakers, ask questions to your heart's content. But for now, we want to focus on our speakers, please. So thank you all for respecting this request. So on to more important matters. After all, no one is here to listen to me. As always, I have the pleasure of introducing Jessica Rado, who is the architect and host of this fabulous webinar series. Jessica obtained her LLM from Fordham Law School and is a litigation associate, presently joining us from Italy instead of New York this time. She's a passionate Viz Moot coach, hopefully hasn't spent all night reviewing the recently released problem, but we won't interrogate her about that. And she's an active participant in numerous ADR committees and organizations, both in the US and internationally. So you are in safe hands, folks. And now, without further ado, let's get the show on the road. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for the introduction. And thank you to Careers in Arbitration for hosting our series about careers in arbitration specifically and the 1,000 paths that we can take to get there. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is episode 4. This series seeks to explore all potential ways to get involved in the field of international arbitration. And for every episode, we have a different theme. Our theme today is how can I pursue a career in international arbitration as a tribunal secretary? And to discuss this, we have 2 exceptional speakers who will let us know how they got there, thriving in the field of international arbitration, and who will present 2 different points of view on the same topic. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our guests. We have Ole Jensen. Ole is a senior associate in the litigation department at Wilmer Hale, based in Berlin, and he's a member of the International Arbitration Practice Group. Ole focuses on commercial arbitration matters across a range of industries and jurisdictions. He has represented clients and acted as secretary to tribunals in arbitrations under various institutional and ad hoc rules. And these matters include arbitration seated in civil and common law jurisdictions with a range of applicable laws and conducted in both English and German. Then we have Camille joining us from New York. Camille is an independent tribunal secretary and New York qualified lawyer based, like I said, in New York. She focuses her practice on international commercial and investor state arbitration. She works closely with several arbitrators based in the US and has sat as tribunal secretary on both administered and ad hoc, conducted under most major international rules. She's a fluent heritage speaker of Spanish, and she has worked in disputes both in English and in Spanish, involving parties based in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. So we're really going all around the globe today with our speakers. So let's jump right into the discussion. Here at 1,000 Paths, we like to start with the basics and we like to keep it simple. So my very first question for our speakers is going to be, what does it mean to work as a tribunal secretary? What does tribunal secretary actually mean? And let's start with Camille. What is the role of a tribunal secretary in your opinion and in your experience, Camille?
So before I start, thank you for that kind introduction, Jessica, and thank you for the invitation to speak to both you and Mandy. So in the most formal sense, a tribunal secretary is someone who's appointed by a tribunal president to provide various types of support for both the tribunal president and the tribunal in general during an arbitration proceeding. So how I tend to explain it, at least coming from a US background, is it's something akin to judicial clerk. but who works with arbitrators instead of judges. So the tasks you do as a tribunal secretary really vary depending on what arbitrator you're working with, their level of comfort with you, how much trust they have in you. But the common tasks that you would see would probably be preparing summaries of party submissions in advance of the hearings, preparing a bench memo or skeleton outline of the issues, also in preparation for hearings, keeping track of the records. So I know some tribunal secretaries say they become the voice of the record in a certain sense, because you have to know the facts backwards and forwards. Note-taking during pre-hearing conferences or deliberations, preparing the first drafts of procedural orders, preparing a procedural history and summaries of the facts and party positions for a final award. And in some unusual cases, which we'll touch on a little bit later on, it's even preparing a full first draft of the award. So in terms of who can serve as a tribunal secretary, there aren't really formal requirements, but a lot of the appointments are based on party consent, and they generally won't consent unless the tribunal secretary is a lawyer who's barred in at least one jurisdiction. And then also in terms of employment for tribunal secretaries, several are associates at law firms. That's probably the most common scenario, but you'll also find tribunal secretaries at arbitral institutions employed by arbitration chambers. And then last, but hopefully not least, some who are independent like me.
Okay. Now that we heard the definition of the term, let's talk about another term that we hear sometimes, and let's understand if it's the same thing or if there are some differences. So now turning to Ole. Sometimes we hear the term arbitrator's assistant. Is this the same as a tribunal secretary, or what differences may we notice?
So thank you, Jessica, for that question. I think that gets us to the first problem maybe in the sphere of tribunal secretaries, which is that there's no clear terminology. So, there's no one law on tribunal secretaries. Different institutions give them different names. And in that sense, I would say, someone who talks about the arbitrator's assistant might very well just refer to a tribunal secretary. And, the way Camille described it, I think, was completely comprehensive and got the point across very well, particularly the point about the judicial clerk. I think that is actually how the tribunal secretary position sprung up. If you look at it historically, is that in different jurisdictions all across the world, some judges were sitting as arbitrator and they brought along their state court clerks that they would otherwise use for cases. But there are also, there's a specific function of an arbitrator's assistant or tribunal assistant in a specific context of arbitrations, and that is in investor-state arbitrations. Camille mentioned that some arbitral institutions appoint tribunal secretaries from their secretariat, from their staff. And that is true in particular for ICSID and the PCA. So in ICSID and PCA arbitration, by default, you will have someone from the secretariat sitting as secretary to the tribunal, sometimes even more than one. Sometimes you have two tribunal secretaries. And in addition to that, you might also have an arbitrator's assistant. And that individual would be someone who is not from the institution, but from the president's law firm, chambers, private practice, whatever it may be. So someone that they would maybe in a commercial arbitration appoint as tribunal secretary would be called arbitrator's assistant or tribunal assistant in ICSID and PCA arbitration to distinguish them from the institutional secretaries.
Thank you so much, Ole. There's a lot to consider here and a lot to think about. But now that we know the basics, so we understand the terminology, we would love to hear about your experiences. So let's start again with Camille. Camille, how did you get your first appointment as a tribunal secretary?
So I got it in a bit of an unconventional manner. I think everyone who ends up being a tribunal secretary, I think, comes into it a different route. I guess sort of how there are 1,000 paths to arbitration. There are probably 1,000 paths to tribunal secretaries. But for me, I entered into JD program 100% convinced I was going to become an immigration lawyer. And I spent both summers while I was doing my JD working in immigration work and found it just wasn't a good fit. But as Jessica mentioned, I'm a heritage Spanish speaker. I grew up speaking both Spanish and English at home and really wanted to explore fields in which I could use both languages, both English and Spanish. and by chance signed up for an international business arbitration course as a way to explore alternatives to immigration. And my professor in that course actively sat as an arbitrator. I ended up really falling in love with the subject and worked as his research assistant. But because I'd missed the traditional law firm hiring cycle when I chose to follow an immigration path, my professor gave me my first appointment as tribunal secretary after I graduated. So I worked with him for around the next 4 years, and then the past 3 I've been independent and working with several different arbitrators.
Okay, and what about you, Ole? How did you get your first appointment?
I would also claim that mine was unusual, and maybe since we're both saying this, we should be clear that I would at least consider the usual path to be this law firm associate who then works for a partner or other senior lawyer who's the arbitrator. Maybe for mine, I also need to take a step back. Sorry for being long-winded. But I basically came to arbitration through the Wismut. Mandy mentioned it just as we started out. Then I looked at other fields of law, but towards the end of my, what in Germany is called a first state examination, so basically a big examination to graduate from law school. During that time, I was clear that I wanted to stay in the area. And in the same time, a professor in Cologne was advertising a position as a PhD student, basically, and also working at his chair, mainly coaching the Wismut team for Cologne University. And I thought that was interesting, and I applied and fortunately got accepted. So I had to think about a topic on which to write my PhD. And after looking at different things, it was right around the time that the UCOS awards got challenged at the seat of the arbitration in The Hague. Many of you will know about that story. And one of the arguments that the Russian Federation raised in these proceedings was, as Camille alluded to earlier, that the tribunal's assistant in that case acted impermissibly by basically drafting the award in its entirety and spending many, many hours on the case and so on. And so I thought maybe that's an interesting topic to write a PhD on. No one had really done anything book length on this topic before. And that's how I, learned more about the actor, but I hadn't actually been a tribunal secretary at that point. And then I was lucky that the professor I was working for is also a busy arbitrator. He has many cases ongoing. And at the time, there was a different tribunal secretary working for him, but she at some point moved on to do different things. So a slot opened up for me. And that's how I got my first appointment. Basically having learned about the role from an academic viewpoint and then moving into practice. And I've been doing it ever since, first for the professor, now for different people at my current law firm.
Sounds great. But disclaimer, I don't think everybody's going to need to write a PhD or dissertation in order to be appointed as a tribunal secretary.
I do agree with that.
Just kidding. But no, that's very interesting. And shout out to Ole's dissertation, who is now, commonly found as a book. It is the one book on tribunal secretaries and international arbitration. Let's now move on into a day-to-day operation. What happens in a day in the life of a full-time tribunal secretary? And I'd like to turn to Camille, who does this on, like I said, full-time as an independent tribunal secretary. So Camille, what does your typical day or your typical week look like? And are there highs and lows in the amount of work that you get to do?
So to take the lawyerly route, there isn't really a typical day or a typical week, really. As you alluded to, there are a lot of highs and lows in terms of secretary work, just depending on the stage of the proceedings you're in. But generally, the bulk of my time spent on drafting. So I end up spending a lot of time writing first drafts of procedural orders, working on portions of arbitral awards. Sometimes I'll be asked to write memos about legal research, or I might be asked by the tribunal to prepare a memo of a certain issue and what the parties have argued if they're a little bit unclear or want a closer look at the record without having to go over the record again. I also spend a lot of time reading submissions because, as I'd mentioned before, you're expected to know the record backwards and forwards. So you really need to spend a lot of time with the materials and get to know them. And then on more unusual days, these are a little less common. I'll be at hearings or pre-hearing conferences where I'll be note-taking, also deliberations as well too. Or I'll be asked, in addition to note-taking, to pull exhibits from the record for the tribunal. And yeah, in terms of highs and lows of the work, at the beginning stages of an arbitration, there really isn't a ton to do. It's maybe preparing procedural orders, maybe reviewing submissions as they come in, but really kind of where things pick up is at the hearings and after the hearings, when you're doing a lot of the more substantive drafting, when you're pulling things from the record for the tribunal. And then the other aspect too that I think is maybe a little bit more present for an independent is I spend a good chunk of time when my workload's lighter on business development. So what I mean by that is working on writing articles, networking, so attending conferences, attending events, reaching out to contacts, reaching out to arbitrators who I haven't worked with before, who I've met, which we'll touch on that a little bit later, and then participating in speaking engagements such as this one.
And Camille does a lot of networking events. So if you ever are in New York or anywhere around the world, just always look out for her because she's often there, and she's very nice, and she will talk to you and give you any advice. So if anybody's going to be in New York anytime soon, you should try and talk to her for sure. Ole, you are not just a tribunal secretary, but your primary occupation is that of counsel. So you get to wear two different hats, and we would like to ask you what differences you see when you take off your counsel hat and you put on your tribunal secretary hat.
Gladly, and I think, it actually happens several times a day typically that I switch hats because, you deal with something for a little bit and then you move on to the other thing. But I think the difference is really quite pronounced. When you act as counsel, your job is obviously to look after your client's needs and to argue their case before the tribunal as best as you can so they win or defend the claim that is raised against them. And the mindset is very different for a tribunal secretary. You first and foremost work for the arbitrator who appointed you, typically the president, or almost exclusively the president. And your job there is to support the tribunal in finding an objectively correct decision, right? So even how you look at the record and everything is different from the mindset perspective. The work is also quite different. Camille described it perfectly in terms of what you do. The summary for me as well would be reading, organizing, and drafting. That's the three main things that you do as a tribunal secretary. You do all of these things as well as counsel, but you do it in a bigger team. Typically, there's only yourself as the tribunal secretary. As counsel, you have people of different level, also people on the same level if it's a big case as you, and you do all of that together. But you also have to do more, right? You do the oral advocacy part. That doesn't really come up as a tribunal secretary because you don't typically speak a lot in the course of an oral hearing as a tribunal secretary. You work together with witnesses, you work together with experts, you meet them, you discuss the case with them, and so on. And so these are just added tasks on top of what you would maybe do as a tribunal secretary. The good thing about the secretary role in that respect is that you actually, I would think, get to do more cases overall. Because if you have a very engaging, difficult counsel case that runs for 3 years, sometimes there's not too much more you can do on the side. Whereas I think as an arbitrator or secretary, you can definitely take several cases next to each other and thus see more of what's out there to experience in arbitration.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ole. Now we are looking a little bit into the issues that may arise when working as a tribunal secretary. And we want to look a little bit more at the responsibilities, because tribunal secretary is often recommended as a first step into the arbitration world for recent graduates and young professionals. But we do know that the job comes with a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things to think about. And although the purpose of this webinar is not to analyze too many technical aspects, we would still like to hear some of your highlights and some of what you think are the key responsibilities that you see in your job. Starting with Camille, what would you highlight?
So I'll speak to 2 points at really the initial appointment stage that I think for me one caught me a little off guard, and one is something that I think everyone should potentially prepare for. So for the first one, it's conflicts. So a tribunal secretary is subject to the same standards of impartiality and independence as arbitrators, which means that when you're appointed, let's say a tribunal president approaches you and wants to appoint you as a tribunal secretary, you'll need to prepare a CV. And that one, it might look a little bit different than one typically in an employment context, just because you're going to want to include anything that could be a potential for conflicts or appearance of bias. So organizations you're involved in, places you've spoken, those sort of disclosures that you'd make. And then as you become more experienced too, it can, arbitrators run into this too, it can be hard to keep track of what conflicts you might have, who's appeared before you, who's been involved in your prior cases. So I always really recommend for those starting out, it's much easier to keep track of the parties as you get each appointment than it is to try to compile a list when you're 5 years in, 10 years in. The other portion, which is the one that caught me a little off guard when I was starting out in the field, is that there is some resistance to tribunal secretaries in the arbitral community. This isn't to say that you shouldn't pursue this path at all. This isn't to scare you, but it's just to be aware. So there is a school of thought that having a tribunal secretary is similar to having a fourth arbitrator. And when you're talking about party autonomy, that can become an issue, because the reason a lot of parties choose arbitration is the ability to choose their own tribunal. And there have been some challenges to awards, as Ole mentioned earlier. UCOS is probably the most famous example, where there was a challenge that a tribunal secretary was too involved in the drafting. But with these challenges, as far as I'm aware, and Ole might know this better than I do at this point, none of them have been successful. But it's just something to keep in mind. I know for me, in one of my very earliest appointments, there was pushback initially to appointing a tribunal secretary, because there's a concern. It was when the UCOS challenge had been raised, but it wasn't decided yet. So it wasn't clear whether this would be a ground for overturning an award. And one of the parties was really nervous about the potential for that. So our solution ended up being that I created a list of the tasks that I would explicitly do that both parties agreed to. I really wish your dissertation had been around then, Ole, because that would have been very helpful. As we've mentioned before, he's helpfully created a light list of permissible tasks, which I think is a good starting point. And it's just a good practice, a good way to avoid challenges to awards later on, and just something to keep in mind as you're approaching why an arbitrator might say, oh, I never work with a tribunal secretary, or why there might be initial resistance.
It's very good to know. Ole, anything you'd like to add?
Maybe just picking up on what Camille just said, because I really think it's an very interesting point that attaches directly to the position of a tribunal secretary, which is what is your actual role and what does everyone think is your role, right? If I put my counsel hat on and I get a tribunal and the president suggests appointing one of their associates as secretary to the tribunal, I'm usually pretty happy, because I know, they've worked together very efficiently as a team, I'm sure, before. This is not their first case together. And overall, this will probably give us a smoother and especially faster procedure and get the final award out quicker than someone who's doing it all by themselves. But not everyone thinks that way, as Camille said. Some people think exactly what Camille said. We put a lot of effort into getting our tribunal together, and now we have a president that maybe even the two parties agreed on, and now there's this fourth individual, and we don't know what they're doing exactly. And that's what creates, I would say, most of the resistance that we still see in the field. And maybe just as an interesting point of information, we don't have a lot of empirical evidence on how much tribunal secretaries get appointed in arbitrations. Not many people have looked at it from a statistical perspective, but we do have the LCAA annual reports, and there they actually publish numbers how many of their proceedings a secretary has been appointed. Under most rules, including the LCAA rules, we now need the parties consent for a secretary to be appointed. So you cannot do it over their heads. And that statistic says that, I don't have the numbers, I don't know them by heart, but let's say there were 400 new cases initiated in 2022 at the LCAA, and only in 10 to 15% of those cases was a secretary appointed, right? So you have the vast majority of cases where at least there's no formal secretary appointment. One explanation may be that there's a different culture still in different jurisdictions. And maybe in England and Wales, it may be the case that arbitrators like to work by themselves more so than maybe in Switzerland, for instance. But I think it also speaks to the fact that some arbitrators may be a bit hesitant to make that appointment formal, even though they're not required to do it, and thus do not seek the parties' consent, even though they have someone working behind the scenes. And I think that's not a advisable practice, but it's something that I suspect we still have a lot.
Thank you both. I think we have explored this thoroughly, and I think there's a lot to keep in mind for whoever wants to start a career as a tribunal secretary. But now it's time to move on to our attendees' favorite part. As you know, careers in arbitration is widely popular because it's always posting about vacancies and about potential roles in international arbitration, and a lot of the followers are young graduates or people looking for a career move. So we want to know how to land a tribunal secretary role, because it looks like there's not going to be an easy search for these kind of roles. It's not something we can find on Google or through LinkedIn. But my thought is maybe the job hunt also depends on your current position. And since we have Camille working independently and Ole working at a law firm, we'd like to explore the two options and see what your thoughts are about how to get this position. So let's start again with Camille. As an independent tribunal secretary, Camille, how do you go about looking for new appointments?
So for me at this point, just because I've been doing this 7 years, most of my appointments come from arbitrators I've worked with previously or referrals from arbitrators I work with or other tribunal secretaries who have been conflicted out. But earlier on, when I was just starting to go independent, for me, as Jessica mentioned, I attend a lot of networking events. I make sure that I'm a fixture within the New York arbitration community. So I make sure to speak with arbitrators, especially those who have shown an interest in working with a tribunal secretary. But as Ole mentioned before, in New York, there very much has not been a culture to use tribunal secretaries. That's starting to change. But there are a few who say, oh, okay, I'm interested, but I don't know exactly how it would work. So I took the time to speak with them, and in some cases that turned into appointments. Another way too is to publish. I know I got an appointment from a book review I published because the editor was an arbitrator, and it was really a way for her to see how I was able to write. And I think that's really kind of key when you're seeking out these appointments, is having someone to vouch for your writing abilities. So as you've heard, there's a lot of drafting involved, and really part of the role of a tribunal secretary is to reduce the drafting load on the arbitrators. So if you have a professor who can speak to your writing abilities, or if you're able to publish even a blog post with Kluwer or with another arbitration blog or journal, it really is helpful in terms of working your way towards getting those appointments.
Very interesting. This is great advice for sure. Ole, what about you? You are an associate at a big law firm with a strong arbitration practice, so maybe you have a different view on how to go and get that first tribunal secretary appointment.
I think as a law firm associate, it's probably, as I mentioned before, the easiest way to get them, because all you basically have to do is tell your boss, I'm interested, right? Or maybe as a first step, join a law firm with people, or at least one individual who acts as arbitrator regularly. Because by definition, the secretary that they will use is someone who's fairly early in their career, for a host of different reasons, including that financially it makes sense, right? It makes sense if you put two people's time on a case, for that to be someone in addition to the arbitrator who doesn't cost a lot of money, so to speak. So I think, from the law firm's perspective, also from the viewpoint of training your employees, acting as secretary makes a lot of sense. And that's why we see it a lot in law firms, that partners appoint the associates that they usually work with also for secretary cases. I thought what Camille said about, getting secretary appointments outside the law firm context is actually quite interesting. And I think that's one of the key advantages of the secretary role, that it's actually quite flexible also in terms of how much work you do. So moving to my time before working at Wilmer, I mentioned that I started out doing my PhD studies, and that was actually, a perfect time for acting as secretary, because I would do it, I wouldn't have too many cases, maybe 2 at a time, and could still work on my project, still do the teaching that I needed to do and so on, but also get that secretary experience. And then later I moved on to, in Germany, you need to do a legal traineeship, after which you then take the bar exam. And that's another 2 years of practical training, working with a judge, working at the state's attorney's office, working at a law firm, and so on. And I was able to keep my cases during that time as a, side hustle, so to speak, as an additional income stream. And I think for that is actually great, for someone who's still in their education. Camille mentioned that typically it would need to be someone who's qualified, at least in one jurisdiction. But that's also, again, a culture thing, right? So for me, for instance, because in Germany we qualify very late, it worked out that I did it even before that, during that traineeship that I mentioned. And yeah, I think that's just something to think about. I think once you move to a point where it's either law firm or something else, you'd start thinking about concepts like Camille's business model, that you do it independently and full time. And that, of course, has the added bonus that, the obvious next step is arbitrator appointments, acting as secretary in these big cases and as arbitrator in the smaller ones. And then you can graduate into a full-time arbitrator role. So I think that's, it's an extremely exciting career path. But otherwise, it's more difficult, I would say, to be working at a law firm and then working for an arbitrator on the side. Then you would obviously have to, who's not part of the law firm, then you would obviously have to find some kind of arrangement with your law firm that allows you to do it. But I guess that gets a bit more tricky.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you both for this for your insights on this issue. And now let's get a little bit more practical in a sense. So let's imagine that we do send a famous cold email to an arbitrator, approaching them and asking them if they're interested in hiring us as a tribunal secretary. And let's say they do agree to meet us to discuss a potential appointment. Would you have any tips on how to best prepare for such an interview? Let's start with Camille.
So as an initial point, and really this should apply to any interviews you have in your career, is that you're approaching it not just to show the arbitrator that they'd benefit from working for you, but making sure that their working style, that how they work works for you as well. So it's really kind of a two-way interview. So for the portion where you're focusing on your skills and your abilities, I would highlight areas where your skills would provide a value add for the arbitrator. So to speak from my own background, just to give you examples, and really these are mine. So think about your own as you're approaching arbitrators. Since I'm common law educated in the US, but I'm a Spanish speaker, if I'm approaching an American or a British arbitrator, I'll highlight my Spanish speaking skill and ties to Latin America, because some of the arbitrators I work with have cases there, but they don't speak Spanish. And so really having that ability is helpful for them. If I'm approaching a Latin American arbitrator or arbitrator with a civil law background, I'll highlight my common law background. So I'll say, okay, if as you're preparing submissions, as you're preparing communications to your potentially common law educated co-arbitrators, I can be a check on that. I can say, okay, this term isn't necessarily used in common law. I'm not quite, in common law, I'm not quite sure what you mean here. And that's a value add because it means your writing is more intelligible to those in the common law community. But then also I have the ability to draft in both English and Spanish as well. The way I've heard this defined is as a unique selling point, a USP. So this is something that everyone should think about, especially as you're approaching the job market. And when you're focusing on the arbitrator, trying to understand their working style, what works best for them, I'd prepare a list of questions to give you a good sense of that. So I'd ask, how long are the awards they usually draft? I've worked with arbitrators who say, I don't want more than 50 pages. I've worked on 300-page awards. That really varies, and your role really varies depending on that. How involved they expect you to be in the arbitration. So do they want you to attend deliberations? Because in some jurisdictions, you're not allowed to, and others, the arbitrator might not want you there for the fourth arbitrator, or the kind of sticky areas of the field that we've discussed before. I'd also talk about how fast they want you to turn around certain documents. So if they send you a procedural order or ask you to draft a procedural order, do they want something within 2 hours, or is a week fine? Understanding that's really helpful. I would also ask if they've worked with a tribunal secretary before, because if this is your first appointment, and this is also the first time the arbitrators worked with a tribunal secretary, you're going to be navigating the procedural issues together. Whereas if someone has the background and understands, okay, if the parties push back, this is what we do. Or if this issue comes up with the institution, this is what we do. It's really helpful to have that background. And as a final point, when I start working with a new arbitrator, I always be sure to ask them to the extent that they can share a copy of a prior award, so I can get a sense of their writing style, since everyone has quirks and different styles of writing. And to the extent that you can learn what those arbitrators' writing styles are, the easier it will be to draft awards, and the less editing they'll have to do of the things you draft.
What about you, Ole? Any tips?
I'm just mostly grateful for Camille's insights, because I've never really been in that situation of, pitching myself as secretary, because as I said, if you then work at a law firm, it's more or less automatic, and you just do it in the context in which you usually work. Maybe just to mention, because I know this from conversations with other tribunal secretaries, another point that of course is quite interesting for yourself and the arbitrator is how you get paid. Because there's also no one-size-fits-all approach for that. So when I was still working for the professor, before I joined my current law firm, I was paid by the hour. And then you just agree on an hourly rate, and you write down the hours you've worked on the case. But I've also know of concepts where you agree on a lump sum, where you get paid as the arbitrator gets paid, which can be only many years later after you've started working, and then you don't have cash flow for a considerable amount of time. So that is also something to keep in mind when approaching someone and discussing with them how to do it. Maybe another anecdote. When I left my first job as a tribunal secretary, the arbitrator I was working for was looking for someone new, and I promised him to speak to my network and to see if someone is interested. But before I could do that, on the very next day after I told him that I was quitting, someone sent him a cold email saying, look, I've had this experience working for a very famous arbitrator, and now I'm looking for a new arbitrator to work for. And that just came at the exact right time, and he was able to just say, have a Zoom conversation with her, but then say yes. And I think they've worked together for a number of years very successfully. So just to say, even though those cold emails, 95% of them will be unsuccessful, but it's obviously worth it for sending it out for the 5%, or even the one email that turns out to yield you a job as a secretary. Otherwise, it's the typical thing that you also have with your first arbitrator appointments. It's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because an arbitrator, as Camille mentioned, wants someone who will be able to help from the get-go and provide that perfect work product in a very short amount of time. And they expect to get that from someone who's experienced as a secretary. So your best shot at landing a secretary gig is having been a secretary before, which of course is nothing you can really influence. And the same goes for arbitrator appointments. So at some point you have to get your foot in the door. And I think what Camille mentioned about your USP and explaining to the arbitrator how you can help and make that very, illustrate that with some examples is a very, very good approach.
Well, thank you both for your insights. This has been very helpful and very practical. And you know, it's also great to hear some good stories from Ole and how that cold email sometimes gets in at the exact right time and it can work for you. Then I also wanted to highlight something that Camille said, which I found very interesting about knowing the style of how the arbitrator writes. And it got me thinking, Camille, because at the beginning you mentioned how tribunal secretary is sort of a judicial clerk, but the judicial clerk gets to work with the same judge usually for a longer time, so they get used to their style, while you maybe, you know, you're just appointed for the one case and it might be a little bit trickier. So I thought it was very interesting that you asked that beforehand so that you get an idea of what they expect and how you can send them in a word that they're going to be, you know, a draft of whatever it is that they can be happy with. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. We're now approaching the end of our session, and I have one final question for both of our speakers. And we would just really love to know, what is your favorite thing about working as a tribunal secretary? And if you can make it funny, we're even happier. Camille, what about you? What's your favorite thing?
I'm not sure how funny it is, but I think what I enjoy the most is being the fly on the wall during the arbitration proceeding. So as Ole mentioned earlier, tribunal secretaries tend to get appointed on cases that are much larger than you would necessarily work on as an arbitrator. So you really get to see how some of the top minds in the field are approaching the same issues, how they're deliberating about them, how they're writing about them, how they're discussing the issues amongst themselves. And so you really get to follow and see how they're approaching it. But for the most part, the pressure's off. So if the decision ends up getting challenged, hopefully not, but you're not necessarily under the same pressure you would be as an arbitrator. So it really is an amazing learning tool. It's a way to work on these high value disputes without necessarily taking on the full responsibility of an arbitrator. And the other thing I'll add too, for those of you who are looking to do tribunal secretary work along with counsel work, it's a really great way to see what good advocacy is and what bad advocacy is. And that's really a skill that you can take into your practice, and that's valuable regardless of where you end up.
What about you, Ole? What's your favorite thing?
All of what Camille just said. And, you know, maybe not funny, instead a bit nerdy, but I really like that educational aspect of it, right? You see that arbitration unfold from the very initial stages, the arbitral tribunal getting appointed, until the very final stages of rendering the award, and you see everything that happens in between. And you do that from, as Camille just mentioned, a perspective that as counsel you wouldn't typically have, but that is extremely educational to see, you know, that, for instance, aggressive conduct, I've never seen a tribunal that liked aggressive conduct and was impressed by it, right? And nevertheless, you see it a lot in advocacy from counsel. So that is a takeaway that you can have quite early on. The styles of deliberations can be entirely different, right? Some tribunals do most of the stuff by email. Others get on a Zoom call regularly, and then, you know, for the final decision, you of course meet in person and deliberate. You get lots of templates. So, you know, the amount of terms of reference and procedural orders #1 that I now have in my hard drive actually makes it quite nice at some point then, you know, to do your own PO1s as an arbitrator and so on. So it is really a long-term investment, that time as a secretary, I would say, that compounds over time just because you gain all of that experience. And if I do have to say something on a lighter note, then that it's quite nice to be in the tribunal shoes during a hearing as compared to counsel shoes. You sleep a lot more, and you go out for dinner every night with the tribunal, or most nights, I would say. Whereas otherwise you might be sitting in your war room and preparing cross-examinations for the next day. So that is something nice about the work.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, thank you both for sharing your insights, for giving us your comments and sharing your experiences. We're at the end of our questions, so we are going to wrap up the webinar for purposes of our recording. Those of you who are on the line, please stay on the line. We will just close up and then move to the networking rooms. I would like to thank our speakers for joining us today and sharing their incredible careers. I would also like to thank our host, Careers in Arbitration, and Amanda Lee, who is here with us. And for the attendees, we will soon be moving to the networking rooms. And for those who are watching the recording, please stay tuned for the next episode coming soon on our LinkedIn page. And I'm going to turn it over to Mandy for any final closing.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you to our fabulous speakers. I think we're all fully informed now. We can all rush off and develop competing tribunal secretary practices. So you guys might regret sharing this information with us in due course, but we think you can handle the competition. So thank you all very much. And please do join us next time when we will have another exciting and inspiring path into arbitration for you to consider. Thanks very much.